Amen. Thank you. A Danish proverb says eggs and promises are both easily broken. Norman Vincent Peale once quipped that promises are like crying babies in a movie theater. They need to be carried out immediately. Shirley MacLaine once noted that it is useless to hold a person to anything he says while he is in love, drunk, or running for office. That we'd probably all agree with that. We're all used to broken promises, though, aren't we? I mean, I think the reason we can laugh, especially at that last one, is we all know what it's like when someone doesn't keep a promise, especially politicians. I think that's probably what drew the chuckle there, as we are right in the thick of another campaign season. And it tells us that this is written by Ethan the Ezrahite. Now, we don't know who that is. There's nothing about him in Scripture by that name again. There is an Ethan that is written, his name appears in one of the genealogies of 1 Chronicles 6, and the timing of that may line up with this psalm, which was most likely written when the Israelites came back from exile. So it might be that same Ethan, although we don't know that he's an Ezrahite, a descendant of Ezra. But if that is the case, if it is that Ethan, then he's probably a temple singer, probably someone from the tribe of Levi, someone who gave his life in temple service. We don't know that for sure, but that's kind of a guess that we have there. It says it is a maskil of Ethan. We've talked about that word before. A maskil is an untranslated Hebrew word that just means it is for contemplation. It is designed to make the hearer stop and think about it. Don't just let it kind of rush over your head, but try to take it in and learn from it. These maskils were designed to teach a lesson or a truth to the people that heard it, whether it was sung, whether it was read. If you heard it, you were supposed to learn from it. So this psalm is brutally honest as he's telling God, I feel like you've let me down, but he doesn't begin with that. That's what makes this psalm to me so amazing. In light of the fact that he feels God has let him down, let's notice how he begins this psalm. And it begins with a song. It begins with a song of praise to God. So imagine that. He feels like God broke a promise. God has been unfair. God has been unfaithful. But notice how he begins the psalm, the first two verses. He says, I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever, or the steadfast love of the Lord forever. With my mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generations. For I said, steadfast love will be built up forever. In the heavens you will establish your faithfulness. Drop down to verse 5. He says, let the heavens praise your wonders. O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. And he doesn't stop there, but we'll stop there for a minute. This is a lengthy psalm. We're not going to read every verse tonight. We've already skipped a few. But we see here that he begins the psalm singing about and speaking about the faithfulness of God. If we keep the context, which we're not going to get to his complaint about God till much later in the psalm, he feels that God has not kept a promise, but he begins by saying, I will sing of the faithfulness of the Lord, and I will make it known to all generations. And how long will I sing about this faithfulness? He says, forever. I will never stop praising this God of wonders. I will never stop singing about how good God has been. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. And I will use my mouth to make known your faithfulness to all generations. That word forever, he uses it 8 times in this psalm. Forever. I will sing of you, God, forever. And I will sing of your faithfulness. Even when it doesn't feel like you've been faithful, I will sing of your faithfulness. He uses the word faithfulness 7 times in this psalm. So 8 times he says, I will sing forever. He's saying, I'm going to praise God even longer than he is faithful. But he's faithful forever. So he's saying, as long as there's breath in my lungs, I'm going to sing about the faithfulness of God. And I'm not going to keep it to myself. It's not just going to be me talking to you, God, but I'm going to teach all generations. Anyone that will listen to me, I'm going to tell them how good you are. I'm going to brag about you, God, as long as I have the opportunity to do so. I think Ethan is deserving of our respect for the way he handles himself when God doesn't make sense. Have you ever been in Ethan's shoes? Have you ever looked at God and felt like he has let you down? Have you ever looked at a situation in your life and thought, well, I thought God wasn't supposed to let stuff like that happen to someone like me. I'm a Christian. I'm trying to do it right. I'm trying to live according to God's word, and this is the thanks I get? What about this mercy of God? What about the love of God? What about his grace? How do you explain these bad things that keep happening to me? I feel like I'm Job sometimes. But if we know the story of Job, we know that God let those things happen to Job because Job was so good, right? But sometimes we might feel like Ethan. Sometimes we might look at God and say, this is just not fair. God, you haven't done what I thought you were going to do. But when we feel like that, when we feel like God has let us down, let's let Ethan be the model for how we respond to it. Instead of hitting our knees and pointing up at heaven and yelling at God, he begins by praising God. He begins with this song of praise. I'm not saying don't be honest with God. He gets that. But he prefaces what he's about to say by reminding himself of the goodness of God, by reiterating that God is faithful forever and ever and ever. So I think that's a good place for us to start. Whether it's mercies in the King James or New King James, or whether it's a word like steadfast love in the ESV, the NIV, it's that same word hesed that we talked about last week. There's no English equivalent for it, but my favorite way to translate that word is loving kindness. To talk about God's loving kindness. See, it's not just that God is love, which he is, and the Bible tells us that several times, but it's not just that God is love, it's that he acts in accordance with his love. See, God loves us, but in his loving kindness, he deals with us in a loving way. It's one thing to love somebody. It's another thing to do something about it, right? We can pay lip service to love. We can tell a person we love them, but never lift a finger to help them. We could argue that's not really love. But we can have good intentions with our love. But as much as we mean to, and as much as we love a person, we never get around to mailing that thank you card. Am I the only one? The king of good intentions just don't really get around to it. I should pick up the phone and call my grandmother today and just check in on her. I love her, but I just don't always get to it. Am I the only one? We love somebody, but we don't always act towards them in accordance with that love. In God's hesed, his loving kindness, he loves us, and he deals with us in a loving way. So he is singing about the goodness and the love of God, even when it didn't feel like that's what God was doing. God deserves our praise. He deserves our songs of praise to him. Well, because look in verse 6. He says, "For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord?" Yours might say, instead of heavenly beings, it might say the sons of the mighty ones or something similar to that. And so that's a reference to the angels. He's saying, who can be compared to God? One of the classes I'm teaching this year is systematic theology, and I say frequently in that class, when we talk about God, we can never accurately say, God is just like anything. Fill in the blank, whatever you want to say there, because God is so incomparable to everything in the universe. We can't say, God is just like this, because whatever we try to use as an analogy falls pitifully short of our wonderful God. Now, we try to do our best, but we can't accurately compare God to anything. He says, who is like God? Who in the skies is like God? Who in the heavens? Who among the mighty beings is like God? The angels are great, but they are not God. We can tip our cap to the angels and say these are incredible beings, but they don't compare to God and all their glory and all their splendor and their strength and what they're able to do. They don't hold a candle to God. God has no rival. Neither does he have a close second. Who can we say is even similar to our God? And so he praises God for that in verse 6. In verse 7, he continues that thought. He says, he is a God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all who are around him. I know it's yours may have a question mark there. The question continues on from verse 6, so it's kind of grammatically awkward, but it's poetry. But he continues that same thought by saying that God should be feared because of who he is. People don't fear God anymore, do they? I'm afraid that we have domesticated God. We have made God into something that's not really to be feared. We've made God just this turn the other cheek kind of God, and there's no more fear of God. So many have domesticated God in their minds, although he cannot be domesticated. Many have disdain for God, and others flat out ignore him. But not Ethan. He begins this psalm with a song of praise to God, telling anyone who will listen that God is so unique and that nothing is like him in all the universe, and nature obeys God. I love the fact that nature obeys God. To me, this is always such an amazing concept. In verse 9, he says, "You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them." Look at verse 10 while we're there. He says, "You crushed Rahab like a carcass or into pieces. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm." He says that God rules the raging of the sea. This was long before the disciples marveled that the winds and the seas obeyed God when Jesus said, "Peace be still," and the storm stopped. Long before that, Ethan is writing about how God rules nature. God rules nature because God created nature. Nature obeys God because God created nature. And he goes on and mentions Rahab. This is not Rahab that hid the spies in the book of Joshua. Rahab was the name of a monster from ancient pagan mythology. Several of the Old Testament writers use this same concept to refer to Egypt. So when he mentions what God did to Rahab, this is a reference to the pharaohs of Egypt when God led the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery. This is one of the high points of history for the Israelites. How many times in the Psalms do they reference Egypt? It seems like we talk about this every Wednesday night, so I won't belabor the point. But psalm writer after psalm writer, doesn't matter if it's David or Ethan or Moses or the sons of Korah or Asaph, they all seem to refer back to Egypt. Wasn't that such an important event in their history? It's like for us as Americans, every 4th of July, we talk about the war for independence, beating back the British. We talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. We talk about D-Day and victory over Japan Day. We talk about these high points in our history. For the Israelites, it always went back to Egypt. That was to them one of the most incredible things that God had done. And it was really all-encompassing. It wasn't just Egypt, it wasn't just the plagues, but it's parting the Red Sea and it's manna and water and all the miracles that went along with it, because you don't really isolate those. It's all one big, long miracle that God was working for years to get him into the promised land. So he mentions in verse 10 what God has done there. And he's saying that God owns it all. And then he goes on, without reading all the verses, he mentions mountains like Tabor and Hermon. He says, God is to be praised from the north to the south, from Tabor to Hermon. Those were the mountain ranges on the east and west. And so he's mentioned the 4 points of the compass around Israel. And he's saying all of it, everything praises the name of God. And he continues then by pointing out God's strength in verse 15. And after this, we'll move on to another point. But in verse 15, he says, "Blessed are the people who know the festal shout," or the joyful shout, "who walk, O Lord, in the light of your face." Blessed are the people who know. And if we just stop right there and say, we talk about the attributes of God, things that he mentions in verse 14, his righteousness, his justice, his steadfast love, his faithfulness. The more we know about God, the more reason there is to worship him. Have you found that to be true in your life? That the longer you're a Christian, the more you study the Bible, the more you experience God, the more you have to thank him for? That hymn that says, "The longer I serve him, the sweeter he grows." Have you found that to be true in your own life? The more I learn about God, the more I feel God, the more I talk to God, the closer I get to God, the greater he becomes in my mind. When we learn about his attributes, we want to stop and say thank you. And in light of his attributes here, he mentions that joyful shout, that festal shout. That talks about in the feasts when they would all shout out praises to God. And so we need to learn to have that same shout for joy. That word means acclamation. We shout for our football teams. Can't we shout for our God? Shouldn't we get excited about God for all that he's done for us? And he doesn't mention anything about skill when he talks about shouting to God or singing to the Lord. Like we always say, just simply make a joyful noise unto the Lord. Doesn't matter if it's on key or off key. God couldn't care less if it's the right key or the right pitch. He gave you your ability or your lack thereof, right? When it comes to singing or playing musical abilities, playing instruments. God doesn't care if it's good or not. He just wants you to shout for joy and praise to him. Pastor James Merritt told the story of a man that visited a church, and he really liked it, and he stuck around and he gave the pastor some unsolicited advice. He went to the pastor and he said, Pastor, I thought it was a great service today, but I've got a few critiques about the song selections this morning. And before he could say anything else, the pastor asked him, he said, what exactly about the worship do you think God did not like today? And he said that guy just kind of stopped and was put in his place, and he was reminded that the music's not for me, the music's for God. And so we all have our preferences, and we should. You know, we should all have our own preferences. You might like bluegrass and banjos, and another might like 4-part harmonies, and you might like a cappella, you might like it faster, slower. I don't care. If it's a shout to God, He doesn't care if it's fast or slow. He doesn't care what century it was written in. He doesn't care if there's 100 instruments or if it's a cappella. He doesn't care if it's on the radio or the hymnal or, heaven forbid, the words are on the screen. He doesn't care about any of those details if you are shouting to Him from a heart of gratitude. That's what God is interested in. And Ethan begins this way. Now, don't forget, he's got a bone to pick with God. He feels that God has let him down, and he says all these things right out of the gate. He begins this honest prayer with a song of praise. But now he moves from that into a synopsis of the covenant. He talks about the covenant that God has made with David, and here's the thing. He feels like God has broken that covenant. Look what he says here in verse 19. He says, of old you spoke in a vision to your godly one, and you said, I have granted help to one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found David, my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him. The person he's speaking of here in verse 19 is not David, but most likely refers to Nathan the prophet. It was to Nathan that God appeared and said, I want you to go anoint David, that little shepherd boy. I want you to go anoint him as the next king of Israel. So he's speaking about Nathan, but he's speaking ultimately about King David. So he's talking about the covenant that was made. And then from verse 20 on to 23, he talks about some of the specific things that he had promised to David. In verse 21, he says, my hand shall be established with him. My arm shall also strengthen him. The enemy shall not outwit him. The wicked shall not humble him. I will crush his foes before him and strike down those who hate him. And he goes on there and he continues in that same thought. But now Ethan is stepping back and he's saying, the enemies will not outwit him. Well, they certainly have gotten the last laugh. He says the enemies will not humble him. They certainly have. How do you explain the Babylonians? How do you explain the captivity? How do you explain our temple being destroyed? How do you reconcile these things with what God has promised to Nathan and to David? For years, our people held on to those promises, and he elaborates it here that someone from David's family will sit on the throne forever. Well, which one of David's descendants is sitting on the throne when Ethan writes this? No one. Israel had no king. Well, to be fair, I know I don't get what happened with the lights either. Some of y'all looked confused. I don't know, beats me. To be fair, there was a king. It was the king of Persia, who ruled over Israel, taxed Israel, oppressed Israel, and didn't allow them to have their own king. They had a governor, but no Davidic king. No one from the line of David sat on a throne in Jerusalem. So here's Ethan's predicament. All these things I've said in the first couple of verses, your steadfast love endures forever, your loving kindness is great, no one can be compared to you. On and on he goes. You speak God and nature obeys. You have the ability to destroy Egypt and to crumble Rahab. You can do all these things, but what gives here? You couldn't keep your promise to David? You couldn't keep the Babylonians from invading? You couldn't keep us from being carried off and spending 70 years in another land? And he's struggling with this. He's not being mean. He's not being disrespectful. He's trying to reconcile the goodness of God with the unfortunate circumstances around him. This is what's known as a theodicy. It's defending the goodness of God. We do it today. Defending the goodness of God in an evil world. If God is so good, explain slavery. If God is so good, explain human trafficking. If God is so good, explain poverty, children starving to death, explain the AIDS epidemic. If God is so good, explain the coronavirus. And we can go on and on with this all night. And that's exactly what Ethan is doing here. So I would submit to you, first of all, if you ever have those same struggles, then may you begin your conversation with God the same way that Ethan did. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. With my mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generations. God, I don't understand this particular concept. I don't understand how this one situation is working out this way, but that will not affect the fact that I'm going to sing of you with my mouth forever. I've experienced your justice, your righteousness, your faithfulness, and so I will give you that festal shout, a song of praise from my heart. Though I don't understand all these things, God, it's not going to diminish my worship one iota, because I know who you are. I've experienced you. I felt you, and I will continue this song of praise. But he goes through this synopsis of the covenant, reminding God of all the things that he said he was going to do. In fact, in verse 27, he says, you said you were going to make David your firstborn, or treat him, that is, like a firstborn son. In verse 29, too, he speaks about this same struggle, what we talked about, someone sitting on the throne of David. And then verse 36, look at this verse. He says, his offspring shall endure forever, his throne as long as the sun before me. And that's certainly not what he sees. That's what you said, God. Those are your words. But that's just not what I see. We see his song of praise. We see the synopsis of the covenant. Let's close, though, by looking at this solicitation. He's asking God to do something. He's soliciting God to step in and fix this problem, to right this wrong, to correct this injustice. Look in verse 38. He says, but now you have cast off and rejected. You are full of wrath against your anointed. You have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust. You have breached all his walls. You have laid his strongholds in ruin. I told you it's brutally honest. He's accusing God of this. He says, all who pass by plunder him. Speaking of David, his family, Jerusalem. He has become the scorn of his neighbors. You have exalted the right hand, not of David, but of his foes. You have made his enemies not scorn, but to rejoice. You have turned back the edge of David's sword, and you have not made him stand in battle. You have made his splendor to cease, and you have cast his throne to the ground. No one's sitting on it. It's cast to the ground. You have cut short the days of his youth. You have covered him with shame. And then verse 46, that classic question in the Psalms, how long, O Lord? Will you hide yourself forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire? Remember how short my time is, for what vanity you have created all the children of man. Boy, he's being so honest with God here. He's saying, God, you have allowed all these things to happen. Feel his frustration here. But his question, though, is not, God, are you ever going to? It's just how much longer until then. Through all of this, his question does not turn to, God, are you really going to do this? It's just how much longer do I have to wait until you do? When God is not making sense, may we always remember that he's going to do what is right. And if we don't think that he is right now, then let our question be, God, how much longer until you do? May our question not become, are you going to? Do you care? Do you have the ability? But let it just be, God, when is this going to happen? In my lifetime? I hope so. That's what Ethan says. God, you've created me as a frail creature. My life is short. I'm not going to live forever. And God, it would be nice if before I die, I could see how this all works out. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? We talk about how sometimes we get the ability to have hindsight, to look back and say, oh, now I know why God made me go through all that. Oh, now I know why I had to endure all that. But we don't always get to do that. Some of us will go to the grave not knowing why God allowed something to happen, not knowing why God did what he did. But we love to sing that song that we'll understand it better by and by. Maybe not in this life, but in the next one. But here the psalm writers saying what James would later say, life is a vapor. We're here and we're gone. And he's saying, God, in my short, vapor, quick existence, it would be nice if I could see someone from David's line come and sit on this throne again. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. Ethan died before he saw a descendant of David come and sit on that throne. And every person that has died has died without seeing a descendant of David come and sit on that throne. The difference is we now have a fuller understanding of this prophecy. That the prophecy was not just that every second of human existence there's going to be a descendant of David sitting on the throne. In fact, the nature of the word itself means that once it begins, then it will never end. So someone will sit on the throne forever doesn't mean from David until eternity. It means that once this particular person sits on the throne, then he will remain on that throne forever. Of course, we understand now that this is a messianic prophecy. It's a reference to Jesus the Messiah, who is from the line of David. Jesus is that Davidic king that will sit on the throne in Jerusalem, and he will rule forever. And isn't knowing that one day Jesus will reign on earth, isn't that better than 1,000 human kings from the line of David? I'll take a long interruption in this promise of God to know that we will have eternity for Jesus, King Jesus, to sit on that throne in Jerusalem. Ethan didn't understand all that, and we can't fault him for it. A lot of this prophecy was veiled in the mystery of the Old Covenant. But we must be like Ethan. When we don't always understand what God is doing, and my goal here tonight is to not stand here and explain every seeming injustice in this world. But tonight I just want to say, look, when we don't get it, because there's always going to be things we don't get. When we don't get it, let's just have a heart like Ethan. Be honest with God, brutally honest. Say, God, here's what it feels like. You were not supposed to let this happen. God, I prayed and I had faith and I believed, and then you didn't come through for me. We can be honest with God, and he can handle it. Be honest with him, but don't let those feelings do what they do to some people. Some people walk out of church altogether and never come back because God let me down. Or some people go through prolonged seasons in their life where I just don't feel like praying. I know I should read my Bible, but I just don't feel like it. I don't feel that close to God because he just wasn't there for me. And they go through an extended season, and that relationship grows cold. We can't allow that to happen. We must push through even when we don't feel like it, and we must say with Ethan, I will make known your faithfulness, your loving kindness to all generations. I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. Let that be our determination even when we don't feel like it. And I think that we will find that though it is difficult, we can keep that relationship intact on our end because we continue to worship God. And if we do that, we stay sensitive to God. And we will have spiritual eyes and understanding to be able to remember that he's God and we are not. That it may be hard, but we still trust. So let's have that same determination as Ethan, even when life doesn't make sense. That's the 89th Psalm. Any comments about it? Any questions or last-minute prayer requests before we dismiss tonight?